Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to HCI-space, a podcast where we explore the world of human-computer interactions through conversation with the people designing the future of how we live, learn, and connect with technology. I'm your host, Aditya Singh, and this week we're joined by Professor Kevin Ponto, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, specializing in HCI. Hi, Professor Ponto. How are you today?
Doing good. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And before we dive into your recent work, I like to start off each episode with the same question. It helps us understand not just what you work on, but why. So, with that in mind, how did you get into HCI? And was there a moment or a project that really pulled you into this space?
Yeah, let me give a longer answer to this question. And so on your end, feel free to cut this. So when I was a high school student,
Mhm,
I decided I wanted to be a computer engineer.
mhm,
And I don't think I had any clue what a computer engineer did, but I knew that I liked computers and I liked problem solving and I liked engineering, so I'm going to be a computer engineer. So I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And by about year 2 to 2.5, I kind of realized it wasn't for me. So computer engineering is a little bit different than a computer scientist. You generally work on the hardware. So you're building, all of the components for the computer. It was interesting work, but I really realized I didn't want to kind of spend my life sitting behind a desk trying to design these crazy systems that really no one would directly appreciate outside of the field. Now, at the time, computer engineering was one of the best jobs you could have coming out of undergrad. So my parents said, you know what you should do? You should finish your degree and go do something different for graduate school. And so that's what I did. So I graduated with a computer engineering degree, and then I went to the University of California, Irvine, in this very weird program called Arts Computation Engineering. And the idea was like, what happens if we took some artists and some computer scientists and some engineers and we just slammed them together and did crazy stuff? And so a project that I didn't work on, but to give a kind of a taste of the things that people did, they had a different student in this program who built robots that were controlled by cockroaches. So the idea is you have a robot, you have a cockroach that would run on a ping pong ball. It would basically act like an old school mouse. And then the cockroach could drive the robot. And then like the robot would have sensors that would detect walls that would then shine lights that would cause the cockroach to steer differently. So that kind of weird stuff. The project there that I got involved in that kind of blew up was we did a project called Pigeon Blog. So our idea was, what if we made little tiny backpacks for homing pigeons? And as the pigeons flew around Southern California, we could collect three-dimensional pollution data that we could map on real-time maps. So we use Google Maps and show where pollution is in the atmosphere. So generally, pollution is monitored either at ground level or higher up. This is all pre-drones. So there was really no good way to get this data. And so this idea of like, how do we use technology in kind of these really novel, creative ways to solve real world problems? And that got me really excited. And I often point to this kind of phase of my life at UC Irvine in this, working with artists, working with engineers, working with computer scientists, is really changing a lot of the way I think about things. Um, from that, I went to the University of California, San Diego, and my degree there was computer science, but I got to work on, again, really fun, wacky projects. I think that's what always just really excites me. So there, as opposed to work with artists, I worked a lot with art historians and archaeologists. And so I got to work on a project where kind of the idea of the project is that there's a Da Vinci painting in Florence, Italy, that is actually hidden behind this other fresco painting in a museum. So we were trying to figure out how can we figure out where this is at. So here I am, a computer science graduate student, and I'm running around these museums after hours and going all kinds of places that people aren't allowed to go, and doing 3D scanning and reconstruction. Um, and it really just kind of transformed my way I think about technology as, it isn't kind of this rigid structure that a lot of times we see, but that we can use it in creative and novel ways.
I see. It's a very insightful story, especially about the cockroaches and the pigeons.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, a lot of people might not even know what HCI even is. Can you explain it in a way that would make sense to a high schooler?
Yeah, so if you think about, so I'm going to go back to this idea of computer engineering. So computer engineering is very much like a rigid science where we are looking at, at a transistor. You can think about it almost as like a light switch, and we're looking at how electrons flow. And we have a bunch of these different transistors, and we combine them together that we can build this different logic. And it's all very much in the machine. And the way that if you can imagine, you want to prove that your thing is better than someone else's, well, you just have raw numbers. My system is faster than someone else's system. So HCI, the idea is, a really important element of having people work with technology is the human side. And so we need to not just develop faster computers, we need to develop better computers, but better in this context is better for the human. So if you kind of imagine, studying computers is very rigid, it's going to do the same thing every time almost. We can look at numbers. Humans are a much tougher thing to study. So humans, every person's different. You can imagine this is why, like when we have elections, they have this like plus or minus. We don't quite know how people are going to behave. People's tastes change. So it's kind of a study that combines the technology but also the social sciences to understand the system as a whole. So how do people interact with technology, and then how do we make better technology to interact with people?
I see. This is a very nice explanation. And yeah, and now to, dive more into your research,
Yeah.
especially one of your papers that go into like 3D scanning technology. The study shows that 3D scanners provide clear net benefits in high crime urban areas, but not in rural settings. So, I had
Yeah.
a question about that. So basically, how should law enforcement balance equity in technology adoptions when smaller agencies may never see direct financial returns, but could still benefit from the same technology?
Yeah, I'll give a little backstory. Okay, cut all of this you want. So
Sure.
a little backstory on this. So piggybacking off of, I'd done this work. So this is a National Geographic project. If you're curious about this Da Vinci project, it's 12 years old, but you can find a National Geographic special on it. But we'd use 3D scanning in Florence, Italy to do 3D reconstructions of museums. When I came to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we had built a VR facility, and the reason we built it was we wanted to study health in the home. So we wanted to study how the home environment shapes people, and the term at the time was personal health information management. But you imagine, like, do you take your medicine in the bathroom, or the living room, the kitchen, wherever you take your medicine? And is that because of how your home environment is situated, or is that because how you are? And these two things are really tightly coupled. And we really understand, like, how is the environment shaping people's decision-making process? But that's a really tough question to try to answer, because your home is your home, and we can't take people into other people's homes. It's invasive, they're constantly changing. So our idea at the time was, let's use 3D scanning and reconstruct homes, and that then we can bring people in, and they could all have the exact same experience of a home environment using virtual reality. So this is all kind of out there at the time. One tangent I will say that I really think is fun about this project. So we did at the time a bunch of scans around Wisconsin of different people's homes, and we captured them, as well as we could. So a lot of it's sub-millimeter. What's really interesting is that this is a really cool time capsule of what a home looked like in 2014. So you think of a lot of times when we take photographs of things, we take photographs of things that are like interesting and things that we think are cool. We don't take photographs of the boring stuff. And so we actually have like a full 3D reconstruction of all the boring stuff. Of like, here's what a home looked like. So anyway, as we're doing this process, there was a homicide, a murder, north of the university, and the local FBI contacted us and said, hey, could you come out and do the same methodology on a crime scene? So we went out, we did 3D scanning, brought in the local FBI, brought in the local sheriff's office, walked through the crime scene, virtual reality, and like, this is awesome. Like, we love this. How can we try to do this? And we said, well, that's a really interesting question. There's a bunch of technology costs. So we did what I do in my field, which is we write grants, and we actually were able to get funded on a grant with the Department of Justice to say, what are the costs and benefits of using 3D scanning for crime scene investigations? So you kind of jump to the end conclusion. But the end conclusion at the time was there's two really big beneficial situations in which 3D scanning is useful. So one of them are car crashes. So you think about it, for a car crash, like, you don't really, like, every minute that you're investigating that scene, people are backed up in traffic, it's a mess. So if you could 3D scan the car crash and do your investigation at a different point in time or more rapidly, get traffic moving, that's a big benefit. The other one are homicide cases. So homicide cases, the stakes are just so high that every single piece of evidence is so critical. You never know what's going to be important. So having a full capture of a scene is really useful. Now, one of the things that we found in that paper, so going to what your question is, so if you are in a small town, you generally have much fewer homicides, these kind of big crimes, than you would like if you are in a big city. So when we wrote the paper, we actually tried to build with this tool in which you could say, like, here's how many of these different types of crimes that we generally have per year. Here's the cost of our people. Here's the cost of 3D scanning equipment. And then it would generate these graphs, these probabilistic graphs, to say, well, here's your best case of when this technology would pay for itself. Here's its worst case. Here's what we would assume the case would be. Now, since we wrote that paper, I will say 3D scanning technology has in some ways gotten much more affordable. So one of the things my group got very excited about was in 2020, 2021, Apple started throwing LiDAR sensors on their phones. So they have these really accurate 3D sensors on the phones. Apple still hasn't really done anything very interesting with it. I don't know why they're right now only on the higher end phones, but they're still there. But again, Apple, I'm hoping that someday that they'll do something cool with it. But as a researcher, it's really interesting because it means all of a sudden people with their phone can do really accurate 3D scanning. So I've been working with some insurance companies with this, some different types of home assessments. It's a really cool piece of technology, and that reduction in cost. So you imagine, I mean, that's just a phone, but if you have some of these other devices, all of a sudden I think it will be much more cost effective for lots of different communities of law enforcement agencies in terms of crime scene investigation.
I see. So would you say the quality of the actual devices are improving while the cost of them might be decreasing to make it more affordable for like essentially all communities?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the weird thing with the 3D scanning is the quality of the equipment isn't substantially different, but the costs have been going down. So the iPhone is an interesting comparison versus, so we had these survey grade 3D scanners. The one I used, just to give kind of ideas of cost, the one I used when I was a grad student in 2008 was like over $100,000. The ones that we used to scan homes in Wisconsin in the 2014, 2015 was like $30,000. So an iPhone is, let's say, $1,000. So we're cutting off the zero every time. But the iPhone is a little bit of a different scanning device than a survey grade LiDAR scanner. So it's faster but less accurate. There's different things that you can try to use to compensate for that. The other thing I think we're seeing is the idea of maybe we could just use AI to do these reconstructions. So there's obviously papers that show absolutely mind-blowing perfect results. How well those work in a general case, I think, is always a big question. but there's lots of other technologies and techniques to try to do these 3D reconstructions with, even your phone now has lots of cameras. So if we take the views from lots of cameras and kind of look at the differences between those views, we can try to do 3D reconstructions. So in some ways, I would say the quality is maybe staying about the same, even possibly getting slightly worse, but the costs are going down so quickly that it's a trade-off you might be willing to make.
I see. And these 3D technologies, do you think they might potentially become like the standard maybe 20, 30 years down the line where they could actually be used in courtrooms to justify for like evidence or something?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so another part of this project that we did was to try to figure out what are the issues of putting 3D scans in courtrooms. And if you're naive like me, you probably don't realize that courtrooms are incredibly low tech and have very terrible technology. A lot of the people are like, we're lucky to get a PowerPoint running in the courtroom. We have to wheel in a TV. So you have one issue of just like, how do you get this type of data into a courtroom? Um, you have another interesting question, which is, so sometimes when we brought in judges and lawyers to talk about these ideas. So you can imagine one thing that's very rare but happens sometimes in a case is that they will take the jury out to the crime scene because maybe there's something very unique about the crime scene. Very expensive, very difficult. So you could use virtual reality, have all the jurors now just experience the crime scene in virtual reality. A lot easier. You don't have to worry about contamination. You do have weird questions now of like, does everyone get to experience the same thing? What is the experience like? Is that a faithful reconstruction? Which then goes into if you're, let's say you're a prosecuting attorney showing this type of evidence. If you're a defense attorney, there is a lot of pushback toward, what is this technology? How do we know it's real? How do we know it's accurate? We wrote a paper and got a patent on some early work to try to detect if 3D data had been manipulated. So imagine like if you have a 3D scan of a scene, has it been photoshopped? Where this all gets very, very tricky is I would say the new kind of vogue way to do 3D reconstructions is I don't know how much in the weeds you want me to get in this. It's called Gaussian splatting. The idea is you take a bunch of camera views and you use AI to generate these little kind of, they're called splats, so they're little ellipsoids in 3D space. And if you have kind of the computer figure out how to put these things and color these things, you can get a 3D reconstruction that looks very, very realistic. So with that all said, it is AI just putting a bunch of stuff that it thinks looks correct. So a bunch of 3D points in space that it thinks looks correct. So this is a little bit different than 10 years ago where we try to use a bunch of math and we could with a 3D LiDAR scanner, we can very accurately say, here is the amount of error that we expect when you start to add these things together. We expect this error to accumulate in a certain way. We kind of can't say any of that stuff anymore. And so it gets, once you're using AI to do 3D reconstructions, how do you know? In some ways, it already is manipulated. AI manipulated to try to make it look good. So how do we, investigate the fidelity of a 3D environment? Again, with some of these crimes, when you have these cases, the stakes are very, very high.
I see. Yeah, no, I agree. I feel like, especially with courtrooms, I don't think they're too tech savvy. Because yeah, I mean, the possibility of having VR might potentially work out, but yeah, again, the stakes and the ultimate tech savviness of courtrooms may take it a while. But
Yep.
yeah, deviating from that question, coming more to your VR and HCI research, do you think you could talk more about like any special research or some cool things you found in your research regarding VR and HCI?
Yeah, I mean, I think to talk maybe at the field in general, um, it's we're at an interesting stage in which what everybody's wanted for a long time is what you see in movies, which is you put on a pair of sunglasses and all of a sudden virtual content can seamlessly integrate with real world content. And in some ways it feels like we're getting close to that point. In other ways, it's hard to say. So Meta just released a new pair of these. Uh, again, they look like sunglasses form factor. If you read some news articles, they kind of sound like they're going to be this thing that I just described, right? Put on sunglasses, AR content is integrated with my real world. When you actually look at what they've released, it actually looks very similar to a product that Google released 10 years ago called Google Glass, which had a huge uproar at the time. People were very angry. A lot of it had to do with just being recorded in public, which now doesn't seem to be an issue for a lot of people. But it does seem to be kind of a rehash of that, which it's much more of a floating TV screen that comes with you. So it isn't really meant, it's more of a heads-up display than is an augmented reality device. Other company, I mean, we keep hearing rumors about some of the big tech companies having internal products that sound like these type of sunglasses things. But the tough part with all of this is, how do you get the computation power on the device that then isn't so heavy, but you need to power it. But if you have lots of power, then you need a battery, but then the battery's heavy. So where do you put the battery? So it's just a really, really tough problem. And augmented reality is a much tougher problem than virtual reality, because in virtual reality, if the tracking gets off a little bit, if you've been in a virtual experience, you probably have had this where like you start a game facing some direction and you run around and then you take off the headset and you're facing a different direction, because over time there was this drift in the tracking and you kind of don't care. In AR, like any drift, you're going to immediately notice. So it's just a much, much tougher problem. In terms of my research, I started out originally much more in the virtual reality context. So we have a room called a cave that the floor and the walls and the ceiling are all 3D projections. And so you go in there and it's kind of like a mini holodeck. And that was before Meta came out, Oculus, all of that. So now we still use that a little bit. It's really cool, in all honesty. But we do lots of stuff with VR headsets. But recently we've moved much more into augmented reality and mixed reality. So using Microsoft has a device from a few years ago. We were working with first responders in terms of could we help first responders with augmented reality? So Microsoft's device is called the HoloLens. It again is much closer to this sunglasses form factor, but have been doing stuff with a lot of phone-based augmented reality just because it's so accessible. It's really easy to have people say like pull out your phone, have it scan the environment. As with lots of people, AI is really reshaping what we do. So the fact that all of a sudden computers are good pattern recognizers. So that used to be, I'd say, one of the things that humans could always beat computers on was just like we could look at something and understand these patterns, where we'd have to explicitly program that into a computer. And the last 5 years, computer science has kind of figured that out. And that's really changed a lot of what we do in terms of, using it to have the device understand the environment and use that to help guide people or make decisions or show them where to go. I could go on for a while. I don't ramble too much.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just curious because this might not be the best question, but actually, I had no idea there's a difference between VR and AR. Do you think you
Yeah.
could explain that
I mean, let
distinction?
me explain that, because I think it oftentimes gets kind of like people don't know quite what the difference is. And then there's this term XR, which is just like all encompassing. And actually, I think the distinction is helpful to think through. So so virtual reality would be, imagine that when I'm in VR, the perfect VR would be, once I go in there, I no longer think of myself as being where my physical body is. I think of myself as being wherever my virtual body representation is. So I am completely in the virtual world. So augmented reality, if you imagine you have the real world or the physical world and the virtual world, is much closer to that physical part of the world. So kind of the classic example I would give is in sports. So the first one I remember seeing this was for the NFL. They'd have the yellow line that would show you where the first down line is. Now we see this in all kinds of sports, right? We see these virtual overlays that show you where a player is, where a team is, maybe these directions. And none of that stuff actually exists in the real world. It's just is kind of virtual content overlaid on top of the real world. Now, if you imagine this so you have the real world and the virtual world. If you go right in the middle in between those two, I would call that mixed reality. So mixed reality kind of oftentimes is like anywhere in the middle, but if you kind of imagine the middle point between those two as kind of mixed reality. And the way I would push on this is to say, so in augmented reality, the physical world drives what's happening, and you're just augmenting the world with virtual stuff, right? So like the players in football, they don't see the yellow line. The yellow line isn't affecting them. We're just drawing that where it is. So in mixed reality environment, imagine you somehow had a perfect interplay between the virtual world and the real world. So like if I like imagine the virtual world could actually affect the real world. So I did a little bit of this type of stuff a long time ago with little remote control cars. But like imagine like the virtual world would, a virtual wave would crash into a car and push it backwards or something like that. So all of a sudden the virtual world can affect the physical world, and the physical world can affect the virtual world. So that the perfect version of that probably doesn't exist, but that's kind of what mixed reality is. And then there is a term called augmented virtuality that is very confusing. But if you imagine like augmented reality is like halfway between mixed reality and real reality, imagine kind of halfway between mixed reality and virtual reality. Is that it's a little bit trickier to describe. This would be, again, the virtual world is driving everything, and the real world is kind of augmenting the virtual reality.
I
Is that
see.
is that kind of helpful?
Yeah, no, yeah, that
Yeah.
definitely clears up the distinctions. Yeah. But yeah, coming back to more general questions, this is what part of the future of HCI excites you the most, and what worries you the most?
Yeah, I mean, AI worries me the most.
Hmm.
I I don't know really. I gave a talk about AI 6 months ago that already, I mean, the field is moving so fast, like already starts to feel dated. Um, I think the big question with AI is, are we on a curve that is a plateauing, or are we on a curve that is exponentially growing? Because we had this boom, and what direction are we going? And it's really hard to figure out. Um, in some ways, things look like we're hitting the limits of what LLMs can do, but then in other ways, it looks like maybe some of these other new techniques are going to kind of exponentially compound on themselves. And how that affects just everything. I mean, it is literally everything in the world is a big question. So I think there's, a possibility that all of our technology has some kind of AI chip in it, or the interconnectedness. It's hard to even figure out where things could go, because we have never been in the place that we are right now as a society. In terms of I guess it's just a big question mark, right? So I think with all technology, it's a double-edged sword. There's great things that you get from it, and also negative things. Uh, VR, XR has always been the same. I remember I've always told my classes, like, there's going to be a day where somebody goes into a VR scenario and um, doesn't forgets to eat or drink and ends up, in the hospital or maybe passing away. And it's going to be, people are going to point to this as, maybe a negative and a device, and maybe it'll be compared to drugs. I don't know. The really scary day, kind of the singularity point for VR, is the day when someone goes into a virtual experience and doesn't know that they're in a virtual experience anymore. And that is, luckily right now when you go into VR, it's very obvious you're in VR. You may kind of forget at moments. This room that we have that you go into, it's really interesting. If you're in that room for a couple minutes, you have no idea where the door you came in is. Like, absolutely none. It's cool, but kind of scary. But again, you're in VR. The day you don't know you're in VR is really scary. And that day still feels like it's a ways off. But in terms of things that are really exciting, I think the new devices, especially for AR, the idea of getting right now, like VR, especially for consumers, feels like ski goggles with cell phones strapped to them, and it's not very ergonomically friendly experience, right? Like the headsets are heavy, they get kind of hot. It's really tiring to wear it for a long time. If you can start to really get those problems mitigated, let's just say, it would be awesome to like sit in my living room and have a sporting experience where it like surrounds me.
Mhm.
Right now, like that, I don't want to wear an Oculus headset for 4 hours straight, or a Vision Pro, pick whatever headset you want. But if it's just some really lightweight glasses I put on, or there's no glasses, it just transforms my world around me. That sounds awesome, right? And I think the other thing I'm really excited about is trying to be able to do reconstructions of different places, uh, hopefully real time. So we've always heard this term telepresence. So imagine, as opposed to like seeing a 2D video from someone else's view, you could actually like see kind of the world from their view. And to me, like, where this gets exciting is like, imagine doing shipwrecks or these other places that humans can't go, to be able to like experience them. I think is really, really exciting, and something that really kind of pushes a lot of my research.
I
Yeah.
see. I think it's funny because a lot of the professors I've interviewed I also said like the same thing about AI. They're more pessimistic about its future than optimistic, which is something that's completely which I initially it's surprising when I started this podcast because I thought it would be the opposite. But yeah, it's like a really nice insight to have.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
yeah.
I think what's tricky with AI is, it pushes at some of the structures that we've seen before. So I guess here's my summary of AI. When AI in its current state is used as a tool, it's great. When it's used as a crutch, it's terrible. And the problem is, to use it as a tool, you generally need to have gone through the experience of understanding what it's doing, to use it really effectively. And it's so tempting to try to use it as a shortcut. So there was a paper. Okay, so this is this is me relaying a version of a paper, but I thought it was really interesting. So there's a paper that came out where I think it's called Chat GPT on your brain, and they had students uh, just use, I think it's Chat GPT probably, right, to write a paper. Students write the paper, then use Chat GPT to kind of edit it and help them revise it. Students not use Chat GPT at all. So the students that just use the LLM basically knew nothing. I mean, having experienced it before, unsurprising, right? They couldn't even remember what they wrote. But the students who did the best were the students who wrote the paper themselves the first time, but then used the AI to bounce back and forth ideas, to correct it. They got the most out of it. And then the students who wrote the paper themselves, were just a step below them. So I think that is very much what I've felt as a professor, which is like, it is like, for me, for coding, it's great for writing code that I know how to write, but it can whip it out in a couple seconds. It can just write it for me. For diving into new areas of like, okay, what SDK should I use for this, or what is some example code for this? For translating between languages, like spectacular, like totally changed my workflow. But for me, still, to have it do an end-to-end system, it doesn't work. It's like an absolute disaster. Because even when it writes these little bits of code, one time out of 10, it's completely wrong. And there's times where like it's giving me code that like I know is wrong, I know why it's wrong, but if I didn't know how to program, I would have no idea. Because the errors are so subtle. It looks correct. It looks like it should work, but I'm like, oh, that's not going to work at all. And the only reason I know that is because I've had this experience of programming before. So that's like a little bit of a weird AI rant. But yeah, I mean, I think LLMs are also like, is this what AI is going to be in the future? A next token predictor, or is it going to be something totally different? I don't know. Uh-oh.
I see. Sorry, yeah,
I
I
think
cut out a bit, but yeah, it's fine.
we're back.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, okay. Yeah, so yeah, thank you for that insight. Kind of to wrap up the episode, and do you have any final words or advice for the youth trying to get into HCI?
Yeah, I guess one thing I would just say is, I think traditionally people have looked at HCI as probably like a computer science field, and like very much like you have said, this is a field for people who are programmers or techie or something like that. And it really is much broader. And I would love to see people jump into this who aren't what you think of as a traditional computer scientist. I think we're starting to see that too, and at least in universities, as this is really, how do we use technology to make society a better place? And that isn't just how do we make technology better? That's a how do we make technology better with the human in mind? And so that's going to be people that come from maybe more of a background that would be more like a psychology background or a design background, or I don't know, law back, right? There's all kinds of fields. And so, this isn't just kind of a traditional, like, I'm good at computer programming kind of person that I think we need to have in this type of field.
I see. Yeah. Again, thank you so much for joining
Yeah.
us on this episode, and thank you for your insights in HCI. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. I was curious.